time to master pedal. I'ma tell the whole truth and shame the devil.
Shalom, thank you for checking in here at Word Made Fresh. I am Shalama, and if you're new, want to say welcome to you. If you're returning, definitely want to thank you once again for coming back and checking us out. We are, I think 7 deep now in our series of Torah, and we're simply talking about, the role that Torah plays in the life of a believer today. And so if you haven't checked out the previous videos, please do so to help you understand, where we stand and why we stand where we stand when it comes to this matter. And we're just going to jump right into it, really. We're looking at Paul's epistles again. The last video, we kind of went over, why Paul's epistles are so difficult to understand. So if you haven't looked at that one, at least check that one out as well. But we're looking at another one, his epistles, and it's his letter to Ephesus. And so let's go to Ephesians chapter number 2. And let's look at verse number 12 and following here. And the word says this, that at that time you were without Mashiach, excluded from the citizenship of Yahusha, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no expectation and without Elohim in the world. But now Mashiach Yahusha, you who once were far off, have been brought near by the blood of Mashiach. For he is our peace, who has made both one, and having broken down the partition of the barrier, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, the Torah of the commands in dogma, so as to create in himself one renewed man from the two, thus making peace. So when we're reading just those, several passages right there, one, overall theme that Paul is he's trying to emphasize here is unity and peace, right? And so he starts off verse number 12 by simply saying, there's non-Yasharel and there's Yasharel, right? And because they're non-Yasharel, he calls them, he says that you were excluded from the citizenship of Yasharel. Why? Because they weren't blood Yasharel. They didn't have any descendants that came from Yasharel. These were other nations that they came from. And so he says that you were excluded from the citizenship, right? And then he goes on to say that you were strangers from the covenants of promise. Why were they strangers? Well, when you read the scriptures, you understand that the covenants were only made to Yasharel. They weren't made to anybody else. The old or the renewed covenant were only made to Yasharel. Did that mean that, other nations could not be included in that? No, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But the covenants themselves were only made to Yasharel. So he starts off there, right? But he says, even with that being the case, but now in Mashiach, he says that you who were far off, you've been brought near. That's verse number 13. And verse number 14 and 15 is what we're really going to focus on. But he says, talking about Mashiach, he says, for he is our peace. And he says, who has made both one. And this phrase here, he says, having broken down the partition of the barrier. The partition of the barrier, when you look at the definitions of those words, it just simply means it was a dividing wall. That's it. There was something between Yasharel and other nations that prevented them from joining and being unified in one body. Remember, he's emphasizing unity, and he says there was a dividing wall. There was something that stopped them from being unified in one body. And so he continues on in verse number 15. And he's talking about Yahusha once again. He says, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, meaning that this dividing wall that prevented unity was the cause of hostility between Yasharel and non-Yasharel, all right? And so he goes on to explain, what this middle wall was, what this middle wall that caused hostility was. He says the Torah of the commands in dogma, right? And so when we look at that phrase, commands and dogma, which we're going to focus on, we got to understand something about Paul. Paul knew Torah. He knew it like the back of his hand. And one place it said he was blameless. So he knew Torah. He used the word, all throughout his letters. And one thing he knew is, he knew how to say it. If he's talking about the Torah of Elohim, he would say the Torah of Elohim. He's talking about the Torah of Moses or Masha, he would say the same thing, right? Or he would just say the Torah. So Paul knew how to describe the Torah. And in this passage, it ought to raise some questions when we see this phrase commands and dogma, because as you read the scriptures, you don't see that phrase anywhere else in the scriptures describing the Torah of Masha or the Torah of Elohim. And so we got to answer that, investigate a little bit more. What is commands and dogma? And that's what we're really going to focus on here, right? So look at the definition of this word dogma. That's what we're going to focus on, because the word commands just means commands. But this word dogma, let's look at Thayer's here. The word dogma means in Thayer's, it's doctrine, decree, it's ordinance. It says of public decrees, of the Roman Senate, of rulers. It even has in there as a secondary, says the rules and requirements of the law of Masha, Moses. It says of certain decrees of the apostles related to right living. Strong's has it as, the base. It says a law, a civil ceremony, ecclesiastical decree, ordinance. And so you get the idea that this word here that is translated into ordinances in some translations, but we have it here as dogma. Strong says it's a law, but we already have a word for law. It's the word nomos in the Greek that we saw in the beginning of the verse. And so this is not talking about the same type of law that nomos, the Greek word, is talking about. This is something different, right? So what exactly is dogma? Well, this word is used just 5 times in the scriptures, and we won't go through all of them. But as you look at this word, it's translated in other places as decree. And you look at the decrees that is translated as, it's really just human instruments proclaiming something is a law, right? Well, if you remember back in verse number 14, as we look at it again, he says that these commands, or this law that consisted of commands and dogma, number one, what it did, it was a wall. It prevented non-Yasharel from joining with Yasharel into one body, right? So we got to look for something that, has that in its description. Then secondly, it said it created hostility, right? And when we think about the Torah of Elohim, when you don't know it, you would think that it created hostility. You would think that it was a barrier. But when you study and look at Torah and understand it, Torah did the exact opposite of that. As a matter of fact, let's read some passages of scripture so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Exodus chapter 12, verse 48 through 49. Listen to what it says. And when a stranger sojourns with you and shall perform the Pesach, well, that's the Passover to Elohim, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near and perform it. And he shall be as a native of the land, but let no uncircumcised eat of it. There is one Torah for the native born and for the stranger who sojourns among you. So Exodus tells us, listen, it made provisions for those who were non-Yasharel to participate in the feast days of Yah. It wasn't a dividing wall. It actually opened up a door, if you will, so that they could participate with Yasharel in the feast, right? That's just one example. Look at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34. Let the stranger who dwells among you be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Mizraim, or that's Egypt. I am Yahweh, your Elohim. So Leviticus 19 tells us that, not only were they able to participate in the feast days, but he said for those strangers meaning they were not blood Yasharel. He said for those strangers that are among you, he said you ought to treat them as native born. You ought to love them. And so when we get this idea of, Torah creating hostility, when you read Torah and understand it, it did the exact opposite of that. It, made a way for non-Yasharel to join into Yasharel. It made a way for them to participate in the feast days. So Torah clearly did not create a hostility between Yasharel and non-Yasharel. So we ask ourselves the question, and then what was it that created that hostility? Well, again, when we look at the word dogma and understand that the idea is more so of man-made decrees, man-made ordinances, man-made laws, then it makes more sense when we go to what the scripture shows us. If you recall, Yahusha chided and rebuked the Pharisees and the scribes numerous times for doing what? They were adding to the Torah. And some of those traditions created hostility between Yasharel and non-Yasharel. This is what I'm talking about. Look at Mark chapter 7, verse 13. He says this in Mark 7:13. We've heard this before. He says, nullifying the word of Elohim through your tradition, which you have handed down, and many such traditions you do. Right? So the word is clear that the Yehudim, or the Jews, they had plenty of traditions, but those traditions were not part of the word of Elohim. As you read that passage, he was going through the law about respecting mother and father, and they just completely misinterpreted it. And because they misinterpreted it, they practiced it wrong, right? And there were lots of traditions that they had. This is what I'm talking about. Go down to Acts chapter number 10. And we know this is to be the vision of Kepha or Peter. And he says this, Kepha, he says, and he said to them, you know that a Yehudi man is not allowed, or other translations have it as unlawful, to associate with or go to one of another race. But Elohim has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Where did that come from? It didn't come from Yah himself. It came from the scribes and the priests who simply misinterpreted the law. Therefore, they had these laws that were yoked on the people, that created hostility between Yasharel and other groups. Right? The reality is that Peter and some of the others there, you can call it what it is. They were racist. And that's what it is. They had laws that set up and that, created racism or segregation. Literally, they could not be joined into one body because of these man-made laws. You know, racism is not new. Segregation is not new. There's nothing new under the sun. We had laws in this land that did the exact same thing. We still have people who are of the mindset within both Yasserel and non-Yasserel who are of the mindset that we shouldn't be in together into one body, that the good news shouldn't be preached to anybody else besides, this particular group. That still exists today, just as it did back then. That is a man-made tradition. That is a man-made law. That does not come from Yah himself. So back to Ephesians, now in chapter number 2, it says that this is what Yahusha came and he broke down, or he abolished in his flesh, right? How exactly did he do that? Well, let's go to Matthew. And in Matthew chapter number 15, the word says this in verse number 22. And behold, a woman of Canaan, or that's Canaan, came out of the same coast and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Adonai, son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with a devil. Verse 24, but he answered and said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Yasserel. And then verse number 28, after they have a conversation, she pleads with him, she's begging with him. His final answer is this in verse number 28. Then Yahusha answered and said unto her, O woman, great is your faith. Be it unto you even as you will. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. This woman was a Canaanite. She's not Yasserel. Canaanites come from the line of Ham. She's a Hamite, African, a Cushite. So she is not Yasserel. She's not blood Yasserel at all. Her daughter, obviously, is going to be of her the same lineage as she is. And so here you have this Canaanite woman who is not Yasserel because she comes from the line of Ham. She's a Hamite, an African, Cushite, right? And then you have Yahusha, obviously, who is of the house of Yehuda. So he's Yasserel. And he goes, this lady comes to him and she says, you want to heal her daughter. And Yahusha said, but I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Yasserel, right? But at the end of the conversation, what happens? He ends up healing her daughter anyway. Why? Because even though Yahusha is sent to the lost sheep of the house of Yasserel, and even though he didn't make his, go out of his way to go to other nations, he did not turn anybody away that came to him for deliverance, for healing. He did not do that. And we're going to see there's countless examples of that in the scripture where he did not turn anybody who was not from Yasserel away. And so even though he was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Yasserel, he commissioned his disciples to take the gospel to all, every creature. He commissioned his disciples to take the gospel to Jerusalem and Judea and the Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the world, right? And so we can clearly see that he broke down that segregation, that racist mindset that Yasserel had, that no one else could be saved, right? And simply, he was just repeating, and he was doing the things that his father told him to do, and he was of the mindset that his father. What I'm talking about is in Acts chapter number 10, verse 34, verse 35. Again, this is Kepha's vision. The word says this, then Kepha opened his mouth and said, of a truth, I perceive that Elohim is no respecter of persons, but in every nation, he that fears him and works righteousness is accepted with him. Listen, in conclusion, racism has no place. Segregation has no place within the body. And Yahusha broke that down. Peter had a hang up on that. The father had to give him a vision to break that down. And he's simply saying when it comes to judgment or when it comes to salvation, Yahweh is no respecter of persons. That's the middle wall of partition. That was the hostility that Yahusha broke down. And listen, we're going to stop right there. Appreciate you listening. If you found any value whatsoever, please smash the like button, comment if you agree, disagree, just do so respectfully. We can have a conversation. I'm good with that. If you're new, please consider subscribing as well. We got more to come. We still got tackle Colossians, and Galatians is a big one. Hebrews we're going to look at as well, and whatever else the Father leads to. So definitely appreciate your time once again. And as we sign off until next time, learn the word, live the word, and share the word. Shalom.
I'm tired of waiting, time to master pet. I'ma tell the whole truth and shame the devil. The Ruach got me.